Thank you. I will take my instructions seriously to keep my comments to 20, 25 minutes or so that at 12:30 we can shift over to discussion. And what I thought I would do is not march through the central arguments of the paper, although what I have to say is fully congruent with the paper, but rather focus specifically on the problem of transformation and just very briefly to launch that discussion, embed it in the broader agenda. So the big agenda in which my work on real utopias is embedded is what I call emancipatory social science, which I construct as having 4 big tasks which have to be accomplished. And if we could really accomplish all 4, we'd have a fantastically powerful and coherent approach to changing the world in the way we want. So the 4 tasks are elaborating the normative foundations, the diagnosis and critique. The second task is the diagnosis and critique of the world as it is on the basis of those normative foundations. The third task is elaborating an account of alternatives that would better realize those normative principles given the diagnosis and critique of the world as it is. And the fourth task is a theory of transformation, how to get from here to there. I think the fourth task is the hardest of all. You can ask a first-year undergraduate in a big sociology course, as I do, tell me what kind of world you would like to live in. Imagine what would be an alternative set of institutions, and just don't worry about how we can get there. Well, anybody can come up with something. Now, some of it's pretty cracked. It's not necessarily very well informed, but still, those 3 tasks are very hard. Clear normative foundations is not a simple matter. The diagnosis and critique of the world as it is what critical social scientists have been doing, but it's hard. And of course, carefully theorizing alternatives that have any plausibility as viable, sustainable institutions is tough. But all of that, I think, is fundamentally easier than the problem of how do you get from here to there. And partially, that's because there's so much contingency, uncontrollable contingency in the problem of transformation. So excuse me, what I want to do is focus mostly on the transformation issue, what that means. And that's really where the idea of real utopias is located. Let me just briefly, though, comment on, not so much on the normative foundations, that's a whole big discussion. I suppose one little note for those of you who have read the paper, I have further elaborated the normative foundations in the current work I'm doing beyond what's in the paper, just to signal that to you. My current framing of this issue is that there are 4 interconnected normative foundations, which to give you the labels, are equality, democracy, community, and sustainability. Those 4. I think from the point of view of this circle of people, adding sustainability as a part of a quartet of normative issues. But I see sustainability as, in effect, the sustainability of the 3 other normative foundations. There's an egalitarian principle of a just society, a democratic principle of an empowered society, and a communitarian principle of solidarity. And all of them are vulnerable to erosion intergenerationally. And so the sustainability problem is basically how do we create a world for future generations in which the values we hope to realize in the present, equality, democracy, community, are inherited and sustainable in the long run. That's not anchoring sustainability just in the environmental issue. The environmental issue becomes part of the necessary conditions for the sustainability of a just society, a democratic society, and a solidaristic society. Well, that's not what I want to talk about. I'm sure there's many of you who would like to engage those themes. Of course, in our discussion, we can do that as well. Let me say a little bit about the diagnosis and critique. I focus on capitalism as an institutional complex that organizes the way economic practices take place, the way in which we engage in economic activities. Capitalism is one of a variety of ways of doing it, and I have a particular way of both analyzing capitalism and how it works and criticizing it. My work is very much embedded in the Marxist tradition in this respect. Indeed, one way of even defining the Marxist tradition is it's a tradition of anti-capitalist theory that insists on the necessity of thinking about alternatives. I mean, practically everything that is interesting in the Marxist tradition can be subsumed under the idea of a systematic, scientifically rooted critique of capitalism that points to an alternative. Not just carping at the world as it is, but both imagining and theorizing the problem of creating the world as it could be. Well, let me just briefly say something about my critique of capitalism. I want to pose two problems. First, we live in a world now in which capitalism generates enormous harms, and yet most people seem to believe it's the only way of organizing a complex economic system. Specifically with respect to the environment, the argument would go something like this. Capitalism inherently generates environmentally destructive forms of economic growth. This isn't a contingent fact of capitalism, it's an intrinsic fact of capitalism. It's built into the very way that it's organized, its organizational principles. That doesn't mean that you can't have better or worse forms of capitalism, but it's an intrinsic feature of a capitalist way of organizing economic activity, namely an economic system in which resources are allocated to maximize profits, which are appropriated by private persons. If you have an economic system in which the way you allocate resources is to maximize your profits, and individuals appropriate those maximized profits, so they ask, what's good for me in that process? If you get a system like that, it's going to be environmentally destructive. Growth and the accompanying problem of consumerism are intrinsic to capitalism. And the question then is, can these negative effects of capitalism, unlimited growth, we can discuss exactly the nuances of what that idea means, and its accompanying consumerism, can this be neutralized without transcending capitalism itself? Is there a way of having capitalism and having a non-environmentally destructive form of economic activity with consumerism under control? Is that possible as a stable, sustainable system? That's the first problem. The second problem is connected, but actually I think theoretically needs to be thought of as a distinct issue. So the first one is that capitalism generates these harms, but the second problem is capitalism also generates configurations of power that obstruct solutions to the harms it creates. This is really the key to understanding why capitalism is such a stable social system in spite of its disruptions, its chaos, its harms. Does the socio-economic system generate, a stable system has the following character. A stable socio-economic system is stable when it generates distributions of power in which those that benefit from the operation of the system also have the power to block challenges. And that's the fantastic feature of capitalism. It generates systems of power in which power is allocated to precisely those classes of people who benefit most from the harms it generates. Now, in the 19th century, it was thought, and Marx indeed thought this, that if you democratize the political system, that would totally disrupt that connection. Marx wrote, before democratic institutions were very widespread in capitalism, to paraphrase it, the capitalist class would be crazy to give the franchise to workers. I mean, this is a lunatic solution to their problems. If you give workers who are harmed by the system the power, what's going to happen? It's not going to be stable social order. It's actually, from a sociological point of view, an incredible achievement of the social structures of capitalism as it developed, that it managed to develop through a very difficult process of trial and error, one might say, a way of having stable, formal democratic institutions, which are not phony. I mean, even with all the corruption of American democracy, it's not a phony democracy. It's a thin democracy, but not a phony democracy. How do you have a stable democratic world along with the private appropriation of the social surplus and its use for personal gain, given all the harms that generates? Well, that's the second problem with capitalism, that it's managed to successfully create that configuration of power to block the challenges to a system that generates harms. The problem here is not that we don't have very good and clear ideas about how to avoid most of these harms. I'm not saying that we have a nice blueprint for a future world in which everything we know in advance will work smoothly. Of course not. But it is not a great mystery what you need to do in order to create stable patterns of consumption that would be compatible with the environment in a world with this population, even given uneven development. We've got solutions to that, and that's something that you've all worked on a lot. It's the problem that the concentrations of power created by the advantages in this world block the movement to an alternative world. Now, what I want to really focus on is then, how do you challenge the system? What's our menu of ways of doing it? Well, I think there are basically four ways that you can be a committed anti-capitalist and imagine you're dealing with capitalism. In the abstract which I sent, I only listed three, but I've added a fourth recently. For aesthetic, it's almost for literary purposes, aesthetic purposes, as you'll see. Okay, these can be captured with slogans. Here are your four slogans. Smashing capitalism is the first way. Taming capitalism is the second. Escaping capitalism is the hippie route. And eroding capitalism is the real utopian route. Okay, let me explain what smashing, taming, the playfully added one is escaping, and eroding. As a sidebar here, as a theoretical sociologist, whenever I see a list of three things, I know there's a missing fourth. And that's because underlying any typology are dimensions. They're not just lists. And dimensions typically are binary in their labeling, in their conception, even if there's continua. And if you've got three of something, there's a missing cell in the 2x2 table. And I think escaping capitalism was the missing cell in my previous triplet. For those of you who teach, if there are other sociologists, a really nice thing to do for advanced undergraduates and graduate students is just ask them to produce fourfold tables, 2x2 tables, on whatever they're working on. And it's very revealing of theoretical ideas. It helps to clarify things. Okay, enough of that. Smashing capitalism. This is identified with revolutionary socialism and communism. The basic logic of the strategy can be called a ruptural strategy. The basic idea of a ruptural strategy is we live in a system that is intolerable and it's unreformable. You cannot successfully modify it in a way that deals with its harms because every success will be undermined quickly. That is, you can't stably succeed. What you have to do is wipe it out and start with a clean slate. smash first, build second. The typical scenario for this is to try to seize the power of the state, because smashing requires a lot of power, and the state is the typical center of power which makes that possible. So the idea of the classical revolutionary vision is to seize state power, to very rapidly change the institutions of the state itself to make it a suitable instrument for smashing capitalism, because the prior state was just not organized in a way suitable to that task. So you transform the state rapidly, that's the revolutionary moment, and then you use the transformed state to transform the basic underlying social structure. This fantasy, I would argue, is expressed in the famous lines of the wobbly song, Solidarity Forever. In our hands is placed a power greater than their hoarded gold, greater than the might of armies, magnified 1,000-fold. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old. Now, those are stirring lines, and that reflects the ruptural strategy. The problem is, after the empirical evidence of attempts at this in the 20th century, that we do know that you can bring a new world from the ashes of the old. It's just not the kind of new world we want. What we have no example of a ruptural strategy that has successfully been able to build a democratic, egalitarian, emancipatory alternative on the ashes of the old. So while I do think that there are aspects of the ruptural vision which remain important, the notion that there are winners and losers, not everything is smiley self-positive sum games. You sometimes have to defeat opponents in order to make progress. And that in particular institutions you may need ruptures. There may be sites of rupture, partial rupture, as part of any project of social change. So there may be discontinuities, but the idea of a system-level discontinuity I think is just not on. That is a fantasy. And it's an attractive fantasy, especially for young people. I mean, I continue to have wonderful revolutionary undergraduates who are just so frustrated and want change now of a systemic nature. And I don't even try to talk them out of it, because I think it's an important part of their self-development to come to terms with the limits of that idea, not for me to instruct them to get rid of it prematurely. But I don't think smashing capitalism is a viable approach towards transcending capitalism. Well, the second historically important approach is taming capitalism. This is what progressive social democracy thought it could do. The basic logic of taming strategy, taming capitalism, is what I call a symbiotic strategy. So the first one was ruptural. The second one is symbiotic. The basic idea is to introduce changes in the rules of the game that simultaneously solve problems in the functioning of capitalism that are seen as problems by elites. So you're doing something to elicit significant segments of dominant classes and elites, because they see the transformations that are being proposed as solving a problem that they have difficulty solving. So you simultaneously solve problems for them, but also make life better for ordinary people in ways that expand their capacity for popular power. This means using the state and collaborating with elites in ways that enhance the prospects for future transformation rather than curtail them, by expanding the domains of popular power. Democracy itself was that kind of reform. The very emergence of democratic institutions in a capitalist society was one that solved problems for elites while at the same time expanding the scope of popular power. This is using the state then rather than just smashing the state. This strategy was enormously successful, way beyond the expectations, certainly of any revolutionary thinkers, in a brief period, 3 or 4 decades. There was this golden era, so-called, after World War II, when in significant parts of Europe, and to some extent in the United States as well, there was what could be called a positive class compromise in which capitalism was in significant ways tamed, and it became way more egalitarian with much greater capacity to intervene to deal with its externalities than would have been thought possible. Globalization and financialization of capital have weakened but not destroyed that possibility. I think it's easy to exaggerate the incapacitation of states and democratic processes that's come from globalization, but nevertheless there is an incapacitation. The reason why this undermines possibilities is that when wealth has an easy capacity to move, to exit, when constraints are imposed on it, that undermines the ability to impose those constraints. And that's what globalization combined with financialization, it's really the two together that's this nasty bit. It's not just globalization in the sense of trade. It's globalization in the sense of the speed at which capital can move. That's the feature which makes it just too easy for people who have personal command over wealth to decide, I don't like what's going on here, I'm going to move elsewhere, with relatively small costs. Not none. There are transactions costs they face, but it's relatively small. Whereas when wealth was geographically cabined in a particular place, it was vulnerable to popular forces, and in which compromises could be forged, which didn't make life terrible for the elites. It just meant that they weren't getting the maximum returns that they would otherwise get. That's taming capitalism. The third one, which I've added for literary purposes, escaping capitalism, simply says, the world is intolerable, I can't put up with this anymore, I'm going to find a way of just living my own life, voluntary simplicity in the woods. There's a right-wing version, the militia movement in Idaho, where people go and create these fortresses of survivalist armed encampments. And there's the hippie version, the countercultural version. But it's essentially giving up the project of transforming capitalism as such by transforming just one's immediate environment in ways that are more egalitarian and communitarian. That's escaping capitalism. No longer an attempt at any vision of how you can deal with the system as a whole. But you can deal with the immediate environment of one's own life. A lot of the voluntary simplicity, that's a complicated expression. It encompasses many different strands, but a significant piece of that is escapist in that way. The fourth idea, though, is eroding capitalism. This is less visible. It hasn't been trumpeted as much as taming and smashing as ways forward. It has some roots in the anarchist tradition of anti-capitalism. Proudhon in the 19th century, in his arguments for worker cooperatives, it was essentially an eroding capitalism perspective. What Proudhon argued was, you create worker-owned firms, they will simply be so much more desirable to work in and more efficient than capitalism because you won't need managers to supervise them. That workers won't put up with capitalism anymore. They'll all join worker-owned cooperatives, and capitalism will wither just because it'll be outcompeted by these better forms of firms. And when Proudhon introduced that idea initially, Marx ridiculed it. He thought it was completely stupid. He called them petty little experiments that would amount to nothing. But later in his life, actually, Marx celebrated. This is kind of a nice story. He thought worker cooperatives were fantastic and that they really were wonderful models for the world as it could be, and felt that the reason why they couldn't thrive in capitalism was not because they weren't more efficient than capitalism, but it was because the power of capital simply wouldn't let them. And he didn't say it this way, but I think one can, if you read his account, a big part was because capitalists controlled credit markets. And it was impossible for worker-owned firms to get credit in ways that would enable them to scale up in the way that capitalist firms. Well, whether he was right about that diagnosis or not, there is a certain pedigree in the anti-capitalist tradition for the vision of eroding. I like to think of this as a way of thinking of how do we challenge and transcend capitalism that's more like how capitalism came to supplant feudalism than has typically been seen. After all, if you go back to the 12th or 11th century in feudal societies, you already begin to see what could be called the nascent seeds of pre-capitalist relations in the cities. There was emerging merchant classes that were investing and engaging in competition and accumulating capital, but in very small niches. They occupied the spaces where they could do their thing inside of a social order that was organized on very different kinds of principles. And then what happens is gradually segments of the feudal elite see advantages in hooking up, using that term both in the modern urban sense and in less salacious terms, hooking up with these emerging merchants because there were problems that they had that could be solved by accumulating some capital through non-feudal mechanisms. And this is a simplified, stripped-down version of the story, but those emerging merchant enclaves became very corrosive. Cities grew, they became escape places. People could actually leave feudalism and enter an alternative space where different economic practices were possible. I refer to eroding capitalism as an interstitial strategy. So you have ruptural strategies, symbiotic strategies, and interstitial strategies, building alternatives in the spaces where this is possible. Build alternatives in the cracks, niches where it's possible in such a way that the alternatives are not merely an escape from the dominant institutions, but in one way or another they erode the dominance of capitalism. That's the idea. Can we imagine ways of building alternatives in the spaces where this is possible, which prefigure the world you want, move us concretely in that direction because you're actually creating building blocks of what you want, but, and this is the hard part, in such a way that it actually is corrosive of the dominance of the principal system production relations, system of production, capitalism. Now, I think that is completely implausible. It's just less implausible than the smashing capitalism, which is completely implausible, and the taming capitalism, which seems to have such severe limits under contemporary conditions. My general perspective then is that actually we need to combine taming and eroding. It's really the combination of interstitial strategies, building new institutions from the bottom up, and symbiotic strategies, eliciting the state to solve problems in the functioning of the existing world. It's combining those two that creates some prospect for expanding the viability and vitality of alternative ways of organizing economic activities. Then what's the scenario? So, scenario building is part of the literary tradition, I suppose, in which these kinds of ideas. So this is not a simulation model. I don't think it's possible for this kind of thing to do that in a way that generates novel insights. You'd have to have the insights first, and then you say, what equations will give me the insights I already have, as opposed to, here's a set of coherent equations. Aha, my God, that's the way that's what's possible. That's my skepticism. Not for the kind of model building that the Tellus Institute is engaged in, but for this kind of problem. Anyway, what would be the kind of scenario? So the scenario is essentially goes something like this. What you'd like to do is to build alternative economic practices and spaces for them so that as they expand, the people who opt to live in those spaces become less and less vulnerable to the exit strategies of capital. So that even if, at some point, large wealth holders say, I can't put up with this anymore, I'm going to move my capital, you can say goodbye good riddance to bad rubbish. We don't need you. And you don't need them because you have built sufficiently robust networks and practices of provisioning, of livelihood generation, that makes possible the kind of alternative lifestyles and world that you imagine, not just for particular persons, but for communities. There are some aspects of this kind of thinking in some of the more radical versions of transition town discussions from time to time. One sees this in, there's some very interesting work by a guy named Michael Bowens, B-A-W-E-N-S, who was the founder of the P2P Foundation. And he has work on transitioning to a commons-based society that's really interesting. And it's all basically about how can you build up the social infrastructure of alternative economic practices anchored in the peer-to-peer commons idea, but including material production and land trusts for for agriculture and all sorts of other elements. How can you build this up in ways that generate sufficient livelihood for people, provisioning, that makes the system more resilient against counter moves by powerful actors? Well, that's almost exactly a half hour from when I started. One last little coda. So a key thing is to not think of this as just the anarchist moment. That is, the idea of what can we build from the bottom up, ignoring the structures of power. I think there are crucial ways in which this has to interface with the state. And one of the, what I think is a pivotal idea, is unconditional basic income. So unconditional basic income requires state action. That cannot be done from the bottom up. It has to involve a mechanism for appropriating part of the social surplus and redistributing it to the population on a per capita basis. Unconditional basic income can be thought of as a mechanism which makes possible people opting for an alternative economic circuit. It makes it possible for people to fully engage in building these alternative economic institutions. In a way that's blocked if the only way they can get a stream of income sufficient to live in a reasonable way is by participating in a significant way in the capitalist economy, either in labor markets or in other kinds of markets. So I think basic income, which is a feasible reform, it's a symbiotic reform because it solves various kinds of problems for the capital system. Basic income can actually make capitalism work better in some ways. It's on the agenda in some European countries. There's going to be a referendum on it in Switzerland next year, I believe. It's certainly being discussed in various places. I think that's a key non-reformist reform, to use an older formulation, inside of capitalist economies that can open up the space then for this more bottom-up building of alternative economic organizations. All right, enough introduction.